The air in the Carpathian Mountains was a dense, suffocating blanket of moisture and pine, tasting faintly of frost and something else, something mineral like wet, forgotten earth. Elias Thorne inhaled deeply, the chill burning his lungs. It was late October, and the kind of darkness that swallowed Light Hole had descended over the narrow, winding road hours ago. Elias gripped the steering wheel of his custom-built Jeep Wrangler, the Nomad, his knuckles white. The old vehicle, a relic itself in the age of computerized navigation, was his preferred companion for his unconventional career. Elias was a collector, a seeker of the impossible. His current obsession, and the reason he was driving through the unmapped spine of Transylvania, Romania, was the Clock of Ethelred, a medieval mechanical device rumored to not just tell time, but to bend it. He believed the artifact lay within the ruins of a monastery dedicated to a forgotten heresy. He consulted the crude, hand-drawn map taped to the dashboard. "Almost there, almost to the forgotten path," he murmured, the sound muffled by the thick beard that framed his sharp, intense features. Elias, a man in his mid-40s, possessed the kind of tired, calculating eyes that had seen too much history and perhaps too little sleep. He'd lost cell service 200 kilometers back, which suited him fine. Silence was a prerequisite for finding the silent places. But the silence tonight felt wrong. It was heavy, a pressure rather than an absence of noise. The only sounds were the grinding of the Jeep's tired transmission and the incessant, high-pitched sibilance of the wind through the tall, black pines. Elias was rounding a treacherous hairpin turn when his headlights caught something that shouldn't have been there. It was a shape, not a deer, not a log, but a sudden, vaporous thing clinging to the edge of the asphalt. It had the approximate height of a man, but it was indistinct, like an object viewed through swirling, disturbed water. It wasn't reflecting the light. It was absorbing it, creating a pocket of perfect, unnerving void. "What in God's name?" Elias muttered, slamming his foot down on the brake. The ancient Jeep shrieked in protest. The figure didn't move. It merely existed for a split second too long, and in that fleeting moment, Elias felt a wave of profound, icy despair wash over him. A fleeting, alien emotion that tasted like centuries of grief. Elias wrenched the wheel hard, instinctively avoiding the shape. The Jeep spun violently on the loose gravel, hydroplaning across a slick patch of mud. There was a terrible, metallic groan, followed by the sickening crunch of metal crumpling against unyielding wood. The world went dark. Elias awoke to the stench of oil, pine sap, and a throbbing, relentless pain behind his left eye. He was slumped against the passenger door, his head ringing like a struck bell. He coughed, spitting out a mouthful of blood and dust, and managed to orient himself. The Nomad was wedged tightly between a rock face and a massive, unforgiving oak. The passenger side was crushed. The outside air hit him, colder than before, and now permeated by a new scent. A sharp, metallic odor mingling with something fetid, like damp linen and decay. He had no functional phone or flashlight. He had only a heavy, iron-handled digging knife in his boot, and the faint, failing glow of the Jeep's dash light. He retrieved his compass and map satchel, strapping it across his chest. He rationalized the crash, concussion, stress, bad visibility, but the sheer, cold wrongness of the shape on the road lingered. He had to find the settlement marked Raskrus on his map. The road soon deteriorated into a barely discernible logging trail, forcing him into the deepening forest. The trees here were older, towering giants whose interlocking canopies created a suffocating darkness below. The wind was no longer a rushing sound but a low, sustained moan. A sound that seemed less like air pressure and more like distant, wordless weeping. He walked for what felt like an hour, the cold soaking into his bones. The paranoia of being watched was suddenly visceral, pressing against his skin like a physical presence. He spun around suddenly, knife drawn. Nothing. only the black, impenetrable wall of the trees. He held his breath, listening. The moaning wind had stopped. The forest was dead silent. Snap! It was the unmistakable sound of a heavy branch breaking underfoot, roughly 50 feet behind him, and slightly to the left. Something large. Something heavy. "Who's there? Show yourself," Elias barked, his voice thin and swallowed by the dark. No response. He waited, sweat cooling instantly on his brow. The silence returned, more terrifying than the noise. A calculated silence, as if the thing was waiting for him to make the next move. Elias turned and fled, pushing through thorny brush and leaping over unseen roots. He ran until the dense forest canopy gave way to something else. A sudden, open field. He stumbled out onto marshy, uneven ground, gasping for air. The field was not grassland, but a vast, shallow bog, saturated with moisture and shrouded in a thick, unnatural fog. This fog was unlike any mountain mist. It was a sickly ash-gray, heavy and low-lying, smelling strongly of old, stagnant water and dust. The bog squelched and sucked at his leather boots. Visibility dropped to mere yards. The compass was spinning uselessly, affected by something magnetic in the pervasive atmosphere. He was about to collapse from exhaustion when he saw it. A vertical scar in the mist, a line of black stone cutting through the gray. It was a high, crumbling stone wall, marking the boundary of something ancient. Elias scrambled through the muck and reached the cold, rough stone. He followed the wall until he found a break. A colossal, rusted iron gate, half buried in the mud, hanging by a single hinge. Above it, a crumbling stone arch offered a glimpse of the building within. A church, or perhaps a monastery, decaying and skeletal against the backdrop of the swirling fog. Rascus. This wasn't the village. This was the abandoned monastery where the clock was hidden. He had found his destination, but the atmosphere was a suffocating layer of dread. The entire structure was a ruin of Gothic architecture, its spires broken like snapped bones. The air within the gates felt heavier, colder. He stepped over the threshold, his boots crunching on something gritty and dry, bone dust, perhaps. He pushed open the massive, rotted front doors, and they fell inward with a mournful, echoing boom that seemed to shake the very ground beneath his feet. Inside the church, the air was still and frozen. Moonlight filtered through the gaping holes in the roof, casting fractured, shifting patterns of light on the filth-covered nave. The central altar was a block of black marble carved with frantic, disturbing reliefs. Figures locked in eternal suffering, their limbs twisted and their faces contorted in silent screams. A dark, viscous residue stained the stone, smelling sharply of iron. And directly in front of the altar, concealed beneath a thin layer of grit, was a square stone panel with a small iron ring. A trapdoor. Elias knelt down. He pulled the heavy iron ring, and the stone slab scraped against the concrete, grinding with the sound of a scream being slowly strangled. It revealed a vertical drop into the perfect blackness below. The air rising from the opening was not cold, but unnervingly warm, carrying the scent of rich, damp earth and something sweet, like burnt sugar. Elias retrieved a small, tactical lantern from his satchel, adjusted its beam and shined it down. It was a staircase carved into the earth, descending into an ancient, stone-lined crypt. As he prepared to descend, he paused. He heard a noise again, coming from the ruined apse behind the altar. It was the faint, rhythmic sound of something dragging. Heavy, wet, slow. He tightened his grip on the lantern and the knife. The open church was a trap. The crypt, whatever horrors it held, was the only direction left to move. He stepped onto the first stone step, the warm air wrapping around him. Just as his foot left the church floor, a shadow, vast and cold, fell over the hole from behind the altar. Elias started his descent, the sound of the slow, methodical dragging growing louder above him, accompanied by a sudden, low humming that vibrated not in his ears, but in his chest cavity. He was sealed in by the darkness, driven into the earth by a terror that was now a physical weight on his shoulders. The stone stairs spiraled downward for what felt like an eternity before finally opening into a wide, vaulted chamber. This was no simple crypt. It was an ossuary labyrinth, meticulously carved from the bedrock. The walls were lined floor to ceiling with thousands upon thousands of human bones. Skulls, femurs, and ribs were arranged into grotesque, geometric patterns, forming a macabre mosaic of the dead. A chronomancer's folly, Elias whispered. He knew that ancient power required ancient sacrifice. The passageways branched off every few yards, forming a dizzying network of stone tunnels, each identical to the last, designed to confuse and trap. As he walked, his light fell upon mummified bodies lying in carved niches along the walls, shriveled, leathery husks. But they were not peaceful. Their faces were frozen in expressions of absolute, screaming terror. Their limbs were twisted, not in the relaxation of death, but in the rigor of a struggle. He averted his gaze, focusing only on the floor and the inscriptions carved crudely into the stone. They were symbols of an older, forgotten script, hints of rituals predating Christianity. He recognized one sequence. A serpentine figure devouring its own tail, the Ouroboros, warped by additional marks that seemed to bind or restrict its infinite cycle. This was not a symbol of eternity, but a symbol of stasis, of time locked and corrupted. Suddenly, a new sound replaced the faint, internal humming. It was a rhythmic, almost metallic clack-clack-clack echoing down the corridor ahead of him. It sounded like the ticking of a colossal, broken clock. He rounded a final turn and found himself in the central chamber. It was vast, circular, and utterly unlike the narrow corridors. The ceiling rose high above, supported by 3 colossal pillars made entirely of human femurs bound together with dark, rusted wire. In the very center, elevated on a plinth of black basalt, the same material as the altar above, was his prize. It was the clock of Ethelred. It was not a clock in the modern sense, but a complex, frightening amalgamation of gears, brass, and strange organic materials. It stood about a foot high, housed in a casing that looked like aged, darkened bronze, interspersed with slivers of white, polished bone. Delicate, skeletal hands rested on a face engraved with the corrupted Ouroboros. It was everything Elias had risked his life for. He approached the plinth with a collector's reverence, the thrumming in the air now so intense it felt like his own blood was vibrating. As he reached out his gloved hand, he noticed the plinth was carved with a single massive relief of a distorted human figure. The figure's mouth was wide open, perpetually screaming, and the clock was placed precisely where its heart should have been. Grief, despair. He pushed the doubt aside. This was a mechanism, not a god. He grasped the clock of Ethelred. The moment his fingers closed around the cold, slick bronze, the world changed. The clack-clack-clack that had been echoing ahead of him now seemed to emanate from within his skull, sharp and painful. The hands of the clock, which had been motionless for centuries, began to move. But they did not move forward. They moved with a slow, grinding resistance, backwards. The air grew impossibly thick, and the sweet smell of decay intensified 100-fold, forcing a cough from Elias's lungs. And then, one of the mummified husks in the niches lining the chamber began to move. It was positioned closest to the path he had used, a withered brown figure in a tattered monk's robe. Its head lifted with a terrible, slow creak of dried cartilage. The thin lips, cracked and dust-covered, parted to reveal a cavern of blackened gums. A voice, not a whisper, but a dry, rattling hiss that sounded like sand spilling over stone, filled the chamber. It was Romanian, ancient and distorted, but Elias understood every word. You have awakened the talisman, Thorne. Elias dropped the lantern in shock. It bounced on the stone, casting wildly spinning shadows that made the faces of the mummies seem to dance and sneer. He scrambled back, instinctively clutching the artifact to his chest. What are you? Elias stammered, his knife falling uselessly from his other hand. The desiccated face leaned forward, its empty eye sockets fixing on Elias with a terrifying sense of presence. I am Iosif. I am the keeper of the Count. And now, you are the next entry. The voice strained, as if talking was causing immense agony. The Griever waits for the broken time. It is not seeking the clock, fool. It is seeking the one who carries it. The monk's right arm, bone-thin and draped in brittle linen, slowly extended, pointing a withered finger at the path out, the stairs. Go now. Run before the tally is finalized. As the mummy finished its sentence, a thick, greasy black fluid began to seep from its mouth, dripping onto its robe. Its head slumped again, its short burst of awareness extinguished. He snatched up his lantern, his mind screaming. He spun toward the staircase, clutching the backwards ticking clock, only to find the passage was gone. The stone archway leading up had been seamlessly replaced by the ossuary wall, a solid expanse of femurs and skulls, perfectly undisturbed. Elias was trapped, and from the opposite end of the chamber, a low, sustained moan began to rise, followed by the heavy, deliberate sound of something dragging itself through the tunnels toward the central chamber. The Griever had been summoned, and it was collecting its due. He wasn't trapped in the crypt. He was trapped in time with its monster. Elias Thorne did not look up. He did not need to. The sudden cessation of the dragging sound and the abrupt drop in the temperature around the opening to the crypt told him everything he needed to know. The presence he had narrowly avoided on the road and glimpsed in the church, had positioned itself above his escape route. He was sealed in by the darkness, driven into the earth by a terror that was now a physical weight on his shoulders. The stone stairs were uneven and damp, smelling of ancient lime mortar and a thick, cloying odor Elias immediately recognized from his time spent in unearthed Roman catacombs, the sickly sweet scent of preserved human remains. But here, the scent was overlaid with something else, a pungent metallic tang that burned the back of his throat. He descended slowly, carefully placing his weight on each step, his tactical lantern cutting a solitary cone of anxious yellow light through the absolute black. The low humming he had felt earlier intensified, vibrating in the soles of his feet, seeming to suggest the entire earth beneath the monastery was alive, or perhaps merely awake. The staircase spiraled downward for what felt like an eternity before finally opening into a wide, vaulted chamber. This was no simple crypt. It was an ossuary labyrinth, meticulously carved from the bedrock. Elias paused, shining his light around. The walls were not plain stone but were lined floor to ceiling with thousands upon thousands of human bones. Skulls, femurs, and ribs were arranged into grotesque, geometric patterns, forming arches, columns, and rosettes. A macabre mosaic of the dead. A chronomancer's folly, Elias whispered, his voice dry and foreign in the silent expanse. This level of dedication suggested the people here weren't just burying their dead. They were building a vessel, a storage house for something that required a constant, massive population of expired life. He was a collector, yes, but also a cartographer of the occult. He knew that ancient power required ancient sacrifice. He recognized the architectural language of paranoia. This crypt was designed to confuse, to trap. The passageways branched off every few yards, forming a dizzying network of stone tunnels, each identical to the last. He instinctively chose the central path, relying on the faint geological knowledge that the most important relics were often found at the lowest, most protected center point. As he walked, his light fell upon the inhabitants. These were not just bone stacks. In carved niches along the walls lay bodies preserved by the mountain's cold and the crypt's strange, dry atmosphere. They were mostly mummified, shriveled, leathery husks in fragments of coarse woolen cloth. But they were not peaceful. Their faces, what little remained of their features, were frozen in expressions of absolute, screaming terror. Their limbs were twisted, not in the relaxation of death, but in the rigor of a struggle. Elias, despite his experience, felt a genuine wave of nausea. He averted his gaze, focusing only on the floor and his compass, which still spun wildly, mocking his attempts at orientation. He noticed the inscriptions. Every few feet, carved crudely into the stone, were symbols, not Latin nor Cyrillic, but an older, forgotten script that hinted at rituals predating Christianity in this region. He recognized one sequence. A serpentine figure devouring its own tail, the Ouroboros, warped by additional marks that seemed to bind or restrict its infinite cycle. This was not a symbol of eternity, but a symbol of stasis, of time locked and corrupted. The clock of Ethelred, he muttered, his pulse quickening. He was close. The object was likely the key or the result of this horrific construction. Suddenly, a new sound replaced the faint, internal humming. It was a rhythmic, almost metallic clack 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 echoing down the corridor ahead of him. It sounded like a massive, slow pendulum, or perhaps the ticking of a colossal broken clock. He rounded a final turn and found himself in the central chamber. It was vast, circular, and utterly unlike the narrow corridors. The ceiling rose high above, supported by 3 colossal pillars made entirely of human femurs bound together with dark, rusted wire. In the very center, elevated on a plinth of black basalt, the same material as the altar above, was his prize. It was the clock of Ethelred. It was not a clock in the modern sense, but a complex, frightening amalgamation of gears, brass, and strange organic materials. It stood about a foot high, housed in a casing that looked like aged, darkened bronze, interspersed with slivers of white, polished bone. Delicate, skeletal hands rested on a face engraved with the same corrupted Ouroboros he had seen earlier. It was beautiful, hideous, and intoxicating. It was everything Elias had risked his life for. He approached the plinth with a collector's reverence, the thrumming in the air now so intense it felt like his own blood was vibrating. As he reached out his gloved hand, he noticed something crucial that his research had never mentioned. The plinth was not solid stone. It was carved with a single, massive relief of a distorted human figure. The figure's mouth was wide open, perpetually screaming, and the clock was placed precisely where its heart should have been. Elias hesitated for a fraction of a second, the image of the vaporous shape on the road flashing in his mind. Grief, despair. He pushed the doubt aside. This was a mechanism, not a god. He grasped the clock of Ethelred. The moment his fingers closed around the cold, slick bronze, the world changed. The clack 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 that had been echoing ahead of him now seemed to emanate from within his skull, sharp and painful. And then the hands of the clock, which had been motionless for centuries, began to move. But they did not move forward. They moved with a slow, grinding resistance, backwards. The light from his lantern flickered violently, struggling against a sudden, inexplicable shadow that seemed to emanate from the relic itself. The air grew impossibly thick, and the sweet smell of decay intensified 100-fold, forcing a cough from Elias's lungs. And then, one of the mummified husks in the niches lining the chamber began to move. It was positioned closest to the exit Elias had used, a withered, brown figure in a tattered monk's robe. Its head, previously slumped on its chest, lifted with a terrible, slow creak of dried cartilage. The thin lips, cracked and dust-covered, parted to reveal a cavern of blackened gums. A voice, not a whisper, but a dry, rattling hiss that sounded like sand spilling over stone, filled the chamber. It was Romanian, ancient and distorted, but Elias, a polyglot of the dead, understood every word. You have awakened the talisman, Thorne. Elias dropped the lantern in shock. It bounced on the stone, casting wildly spinning shadows that made the faces of the mummies seem to dance and sneer. He scrambled back, instinctively clutching the artifact to his chest. What are you? Elias stammered, his knife falling uselessly from his other hand. The desiccated face leaned forward, its empty eye sockets fixing on Elias with a terrifying sense of presence. I am Iosif. I am the keeper of the Count. And now, you are the next entry. The voice strained, as if talking was causing immense agony. The Griever waits for the broken time. It is not seeking the clock, fool. It is seeking the one who carries it. The monk's right arm, bone-thin and draped in brittle linen, slowly extended, pointing a withered finger at the only path out, the stairs. Go now. Run before the tally is finalized. As the mummy finished its sentence, a thick, greasy black fluid began to seep from its mouth, dripping onto its robe. Its head slumped again, its short burst of awareness extinguished. But the horror was not the death of the monk. It was the chilling confirmation that the ominous figure outside was real, and Elias was its target. He snatched up his lantern, his mind screaming. He spun toward the staircase, clutching the backwards ticking clock, only to find the passage was gone. The stone archway leading up had been seamlessly replaced by the ossuary wall, a solid expanse of femurs and skulls, perfectly undisturbed. Elias was trapped, and from the opposite end of the chamber, a low, sustained moan began to rise, followed by the heavy, deliberate sound of something dragging itself through the tunnels toward the central chamber. The Griever had been summoned, and it was collecting its due. He wasn't trapped in the crypt. He was trapped in time with its monster. Elias didn't hesitate. The sight of the staircase being seamlessly replaced by the ossuary wall, a solid expanse of femurs and skulls, perfectly undisturbed, was the final, crushing blow to his sanity. Logic evaporated. He was trapped in a space that defied physics, armed only with a stolen artifact and a rapidly failing tactical lantern. The low, sustained moan was now deafening. It was not merely sound. It was a frequency, a heavy drone that pressed against his eardrums and settled deep in his marrow. It carried the distilled essence of every agonizing death that had occurred within these walls. The sound of the dragging followed it, heavy and wet, growing louder, closer, echoing with brutal clarity in the circular chamber. Clutch the clock. Run. He spun away from the central plinth, abandoning his knife, which lay forgotten on the cold basalt. He plunged into one of the narrow, identical tunnels branching off the main room, a path he hadn't taken on his descent. The air immediately grew colder, biting at the exposed skin on his neck. The clock of Ethelred, nestled against his chest, was now a furnace of chaotic energy. Its backwards ticking was no longer merely a sound. It was a rhythmic jolt, a pulse of reverse time that seemed to ripple through his body, causing immediate, profound disorientation. The very fibers of his perception were unraveling. The first hallucination hit him 20 feet into the tunnel. The stone walls, lined with the decorative arrangement of human bones, seemed to melt. The skulls dissolved, reforming instantly into the grinning, skeletal face of his long-dead father, who whispered a single scathing word: failure. Elias stumbled, raising an arm to shield himself, but the vision vanished, replaced by the rigid, silent skulls once more. He forced himself forward, relying on instinct rather than sight or direction. The maze is designed to confuse, he reminded himself, gripping the warm bronze of the clock. But the monster is slow. It relies on despair. He knew the creature's strategy. The Griever was not a predator that lunged. It was a presence that accumulated fear. Its method was the steady, rhythmic approach, the inescapable beat of the dragging, the persistent moan, until the victim collapsed under the psychological weight of imminent doom. It hunted the mind first, then the body. Elias ran. He took a hard right, then a quick left, trying to break the acoustic line of sight. The dragging sound continued its relentless shhh schluck, shhh schluck. It was always present, always behind him, never speeding up, but never, ever stopping. It was the sound of inevitability. Then came the voices of the Count. The mummified remains trapped in the walls were reanimated by the clock's warped energy and the Griever's presence. As he sprinted past a niche, the figure within, a woman with hair like dried straw, strained against her bonds, her desiccated voice cracking like old leather. He counts the breaths you wasted. Every second lost is his to take. Another, a child's skeletal form, whispered in a high, mournful sound. You took our time, Elias Thorne. You will repay the tally. The whispers were relentless, echoing his deepest regrets, his past mistakes, and his crushing loneliness. They became an invisible crowd of accusers, running alongside him, feeding his panic. He tried to shut them out, forcing his attention back to the clock in his hand. The hands were now spinning backwards so fast they were a blur, the gearwork whirring against its bronze casing. The metal was burning hot against his palm. The true horror, however, was visual. The clock's distortion of local time began to affect his own body. He looked down at his gloved hand clinging to the clock and saw it age. For a sickening moment, his skin wasn't 45 years old, but 85. It was translucent, spiderwebbed with black veins, and covered in liver spots. The glove was tattered and the hand holding the clock looked like the paw of a dying animal. The vision lasted only a blink, but it left him gasping, the cold, stark realization hitting him. The Griever doesn't just harvest fear. It makes you watch your own decay. He threw himself around a corner, collapsing against the cold stone. He had to stop, if only for a second, to regain his bearings. The shhh schluck was still coming, closer now, emanating from a tunnel 30 feet away. It had followed his turns. Elias pressed his face against the rock, forcing himself to think. The tunnels were identical, but they felt wrong. He realized that the architecture wasn't simply confusing. The crypt was shifting. The reverse energy of the clock wasn't just affecting his mind. It was physically warping the ancient, brittle structure around him, causing corridors to seal and paths to double back. He pulled out his map satchel. He had marked this general region on his hand-drawn survey. He frantically scanned the papers, but the charcoal lines blurred and danced, turning the familiar topography into meaningless scribbles. The clock was corrupting the record. He heard a low, throaty gasp. Not the moan, but the sound of labored breathing, right at the corner of the tunnel. It was the Griever, taking its time, enjoying the hunt. Elias scrambled up and chose another path, a narrow, seldom-used passage that angled sharply downwards. This tunnel led to a deeper, more humid layer. The walls here were not lined with bones, but dripping with a sticky, reddish-brown fluid that looked suspiciously like dried, ancient blood. The whispers intensified, becoming a chorus of accusation and despair. The collector who gives everything. Your wife's eyes. You left her. You sold her time. This clock is your only friend. Thorne. It keeps you. Elias roared, a raw, terrified sound of defiance, and ran faster. He was holding the clock out in front of him now, using it like a shield or a torch, its demonic whirring seeming to push the voices back momentarily. He hit a dead end. A solid slab of black basalt, slick with the reddish ooze, blocked the path entirely. Panic, hot and paralyzing, seized him. He was trapped between the shifting maze and the relentless pursuer. The shhh schluck was right behind him now. He spun around, the light from his lantern reflecting off the black mist that was pouring into the tunnel. It was the Griever. It was the vaporous shape from the road, solidified by the density of the crypt's sphere. It stood perhaps 10 feet away, a towering, amorphous pillar of black-gray fog. Within the fog, Elias could see only fleeting, horrible images. A flash of a massive, distorted skeletal hand. A dozen wide, weeping eyes forming and dissolving on its surface, and the sickening, slow movement of what appeared to be a huge, waterlogged cloak dragging along the ground. The sound that issued from it was the grief itself, a low, overwhelming resonance that immediately short-circuited Elias's fight-or-flight response. It was the sound of all the world's sorrows compressed into a single, physical force. Elias collapsed to his knees, not from physical exhaustion, but from the sudden, profound conviction that everything he had ever done was meaningless, that his life was a cosmic error, and that he deserved the eternal, decaying silence the creature offered. He felt the cold, clammy edge of the black mist touch his outstretched left foot. In that instant of contact, he didn't feel pain, but he saw a flash of his entire life played in reverse. His birth, his childhood, fading back into the primal silence before his existence. No, the single, clear thought was his anchor. I am a collector. I do not submit to the history of others. He gripped the clock of Ethelred, still ticking backward, and with a desperate, primal shout, he slammed the bone-cased mechanism against the basalt wall. The impact was minor, but the release of chaotic, contained energy was immense. The clock shrieked, a high, piercing metallic wail. The Griever recoiled, momentarily destabilized by the uncontrolled burst of reverse time. The black mist shimmered and fractured. In that split second of chaos, the solid basalt wall blocking Elias cracked. The time distortion, combined with the structural impact, caused the ancient, weakened rock to fissure. A thick vein of water burst through, followed by crumbling earth. Elias hurled the lantern through the gap, not caring where it landed. He squeezed his body through the growing crack, the bone feel of the collapsing stone tearing at his clothes and skin. He rolled out into a narrow crawl space. Behind him, he heard the roar of the Griever, and raged, followed by the terrible, grinding sound of the tunnel collapsing entirely, sealing the passage with tons of rubble. Elias lay there, panting, the smell of damp earth and pulverized stone filling his nostrils. He was alive. He looked around. He was in a small, low-ceilinged grotto, not carved like the crypt, but natural. And 20 feet away, a faint, undeniable sliver of gray light bled in from a crack high up on the grotto's ceiling. He had found a way out of the labyrinth. He stood up, clutching the clock, now silent, having absorbed the shock. He scrambled toward the light, pulling himself up the slippery rock face. The climb was brutal, but the promise of the sky was intoxicating. He reached the crack, pushed his body through, and tumbled out onto wet, cold ground. He was outside. He was alive. But the world he emerged into was not the world he had left. The familiar shapes of the Carpathian trees were there, but they were coated in a layer of unnatural, oily grime. The fog, the ash-gray shroud, was heavier than ever, and the jeep, the Nomad, was directly in front of him, exactly where he had left it, still wedged against the oak tree. Elias looked at the clock, its hands motionless. The Griever had been trapped beneath the rubble, but the damage was done. Elias had escaped the crypt, but he had taken the corruption of time with him. The world was now waiting for the final tally. The world outside the grotto was utterly still. Elias stood on the muddy ground, gasping, the cold air burning his throat. He had escaped, but the relief was suffocated by the pervasive wrongness of the atmosphere. The ash-gray shroud of fog was denser here, clinging to the branches of the colossal oak he had crashed into. The trees themselves, the silent sentinels of the Carpathians, looked sickly, coated in a layer of unnatural, oily grime that absorbed the faint moonlight. The jeep, the Nomad, stood directly in front of him, exactly as he'd left it, crushed hood, broken headlight. It was a tangible anchor in a world that had become fluid and terrifying. He scrambled over the twisted metal and managed to yank open the driver's side door. The key was still in the ignition. He jammed the clock of Ethelred deep into his coat pocket. It was silent now, cool against his chest, having expended its chaotic energy to fracture the basalt wall. But he could feel its weight, its presence, like a malignant second heart. He didn't dare drop it or leave it. He knew, with chilling certainty, that it was the only thing keeping the deeper horror in the crypt from following him completely. It was a tether, and he was the unwilling keeper. He turned the key. The engine coughed, a dry, wheezing sound, then caught with a violent shudder. The Jeep roared to life. The functional headlight cut a weak, trembling cone through the fog. Elias threw the vehicle into reverse. The tires spun uselessly in the mud for a heart-stopping moment, then found purchase. The Jeep lurched free of the oak with a horrible screech of tearing metal. He slammed it into first gear and drove. He didn't check the map. He didn't care about direction. He drove with a singular, desperate intent. Away. The road was marginally better here, a winding track that led downward, away from the monastery. Elias pushed the damaged vehicle to its limit, the suspension groaning over potholes, the engine rattling in protest. The backwards ticking of the clock was gone, but it had been replaced by a phantom sensation. The faint, rhythmic thrumming that vibrated in the soles of his feet, the sound he had first felt in the crypt. He drove for what he estimated was 2 hours. The road did not change. It was still the narrow, overgrown mountain pass. The dense pines still lined the shoulders. He saw no signs of civilization, no lights, no other vehicles. The fog, however, remained his constant companion. It moved alongside the Jeep, sometimes pooling so thickly it threatened to extinguish his single light, and sometimes thinning just enough to reveal the oppressive blackness of the trees. Then, the first sign of the inevitable loop presented itself. He recognized the landmark, a deeply carved niche in the rock face, where locals had once placed a worn, whitewashed icon of the Virgin Mary. He remembered it vividly, having slowed down to examine the crudely rendered figure on his way in. Can't be. I've been going downhill west for 2 hours. He stopped the Jeep and stared at the icon. It was unmistakable, but that niche should have been behind him hours ago, on the upper reaches of the mountain. He checked the clock. Still silent, still motionless. He checked the compass. Still spinning aimlessly. He scoffed, grabbing the wheel and forcing a shaky laugh. Concussion. Spatial disorientation. That's all it is. The roads in this region loop back on themselves. He rationalized, but the panic clawed at his throat. He drove on, faster. He tried to distract himself. He pulled out the clock of Ethelred and examined it under the feeble light. The bone and bronze were slick, the surfaces strangely smooth, as if the friction of reverse time had polished it to unnatural perfection. He realized that the hands were now fixed firmly in place, locked at precisely 11:59. Not midnight, not noon, but the moment before the transition. The moment of anticipation, the moment of frozen dread. The moment where the tally is about to be finalized. The clock had not only tethered the Griever to him, but it had also frozen a segment of his own personal timeline. The next confirmation of the loop hit him 30 minutes later. It wasn't a landmark. It was an obstruction. Lying in the middle of the road was the carcass of a small deer, mangled and torn, a common sight in the wilderness. He slowed down, avoiding it carefully. But as he passed, he saw something glinting in the dirt beside the carcass. A familiar, dark leather satchel with a torn strap. It was his own map satchel, the one he had abandoned when he initially crashed and fled into the woods. Elias braked so hard the Jeep stalled. He jumped out, heart hammering against his ribs. He ran back and picked up the satchel. It was his. The water stains matched, the torn strap was identical. But he knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that his satchel, the one containing his maps, was still inside the jeep, tucked beneath the seat. He looked back toward the woods. The low, sustained moan returned, softer now, but infinitely more insidious. It was not coming from a fixed location. It was coming from everywhere. The Griever is not trapped. It doesn't need to be. The Griever, the entity of accumulated grief and broken time, wasn't pursuing him through space. It was pursuing him through a fixed loop of corrupted time, waiting for him to break. He was caught in a cycle of the crash, the fear, the crypt, and the escape. He would always crash into the oak tree because, in the fractured timeline of the clock of Ethelred, that crash had already happened, and it would always happen. Elias plunged back into the jeep, his body trembling uncontrollably. He restarted the engine and pressed the accelerator down fully. He needed to get to a town, a police station, any bastion of normal, forward-moving time. He drove for 3 more hours. The sky never lightened. The moon remained suspended in the same perpetual dark phase, always partially obscured by the same swirling, sickly fog. Then the final, absolute horror. He rounded a wide, sweeping curve, and his single headlight beam illuminated a shape on the side of the road. It was a vehicle resting against a massive oak tree. The hood was crushed. The passenger side was crumpled. It was the Nomad. His jeep. But he was in the Nomad. The realization snapped something fundamental in his mind. He wasn't driving away from the loop. He was driving toward the beginning of the loop, in a perpetual cycle that would end with him crashing the jeep again, fleeing into the monastery and retrieving the clock, an action he was cosmically required to repeat for eternity. He looked at the jeep wedged against the tree. He saw the figure behind the wheel, slumped and unconscious, himself. He saw the vaporous shape, the Griever, standing next to the wreck, waiting. It wasn't waiting for the crash. It was waiting for him to walk away, to initiate the pursuit again. The Griever lifted a massive, amorphous hand toward the vehicle Elias was currently driving. It was not a gesture of violence, but of recognition. It knew its prey was attempting a futile escape. Elias screamed, a high-pitched, inhuman sound of ultimate despair. He slammed the wheel, throwing the jeep violently across the road, away from the terrifying sight of his past self and the waiting entity. He kept driving, breaking through the mental barrier that told him the road was finite. He was no longer trying to escape the monster. He was trying to delay the inevitable moment when his own timeline would snap back and force him to crash into the oak tree again. 1 year later, Elias Thorne no longer knows where he is. He is sitting in a cheap, rented room in a small, unnamed coastal town that smells of salt and rust. He keeps the curtains drawn, the walls covered in frantic, scribbled diagrams of the Ouroboros and the number 1159. He tells his story to the empty room, to the indifferent walls, into a silent cassette recorder that hasn't worked in months. He describes the cold of the crypt, the terror of the shifting walls, the methodical approach of the Griever. He is thin, his eyes ringed with purple shadows, his hair long and matted. He knows the cycle is closing. He can feel the rhythmic thrumming in the soles of his feet constantly now, even when he lies in bed. The smell of pine and oily grime never leaves his nostrils. He knows he has only delayed the tally. He reaches into his coat pocket. The clock of Ethelred is there. He hasn't looked at it in weeks. He pulls it out. It is still locked at 11:59. But as he turns it over, the mechanism within, previously silent, begins to whir. The noise is a low, sickening grind, and the skeletal hands suddenly lurch, not backward, but forward. They tick, once, a massive reverberating clack. The time is now 12 o'clock. The tally is finalized. Elias looks at the floor and sees a shadow pooling beneath the door. It is ash-gray, dense, and smells of old, stagnant water. He hears the sound. Not the moan, not the dragging, but the simple, clear sound of a single, slow, wet step on the floorboards outside his room. He doesn't scream. He simply sits, the clock now pulsing violently in his hand, and waits for the relentless count to begin again. Elias Thorne, the collector, has finally become the collected. He will live, crash, descend, and flee for the entirety of his corrupted eternal time. The only sound in the room is the phantom shhh schluck of the Griever finally entering his space, followed by the terrifying realization of Elias that his nightmare is not an event, but a new, eternal reality. The clock in his hand begins to pulse backwards again, preparing for the next loop.